Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Clio Talk. My name is Matt,
And I'm RC.
and we have a special guest, Ben. Ben is a land value tax expert and a person who is currently working on a campaign out in Seattle. Um, Ben is a very interesting man who is very well trained in the world of economics. Ben, do you have any other intro stuff for yourself?
That pretty much sums it all up. Yeah, I care a lot about taxes and local politics, and so that's why I'm here.
Yeah. And we got Ben on because we saw the mayor of Kansas City, Mayor Quentin Lucas, quote tweeting about the Detroit land value tax initiative and saying something along the lines of Kansas City could do something similar. I only know of one person who is able to stand Henry George this much. So, Ben, could you give us like a brief rundown of what exactly is land value tax and how would it impact a city like Detroit or a city like Kansas City? That's probably a lot to go off of, but give us a summary.
Oh, I thought you would never ask. Okay, so a land value tax, basically how it works is it's just like a property tax, but the only difference is that rather than taxing both land and the improvements, like the buildings and whatnot that sits on top of the land, a land tax focuses only on the underlying land, right? The main benefit of this is that it comes with economic efficiency that you don't see in any other taxes. And the reason why this works is because the supply of land is fixed, right? It doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, no matter what you do to it in terms of taxation, or really anything else for that matter. So whenever you tax the production, whenever you tax, say, soda, for example, right, through like a sugar tax, right? What this does is it raises the price and decreases the supply of of soda in the market, right? But with, and this is true for pretty much anything else, right? But land is very special because, like I just said, it's fixed in supply. So taxing it doesn't change the supply whatsoever. So you don't have any deadweight loss going on here. And as a result, the tax burden is felt entirely by the people who are holding on to the land. It doesn't get passed on to tenants or anything like that. So it's super efficient. And the best part about this, in terms of implications for public policy, is that there is such a large volume of land wealth in our cities that we could rely entirely on land taxes and not have to rely on sales tax, taxes on improvements, taxes on income, or anything else to fund government services. And this is kind of the main thing that was spun off from Henry George when he first wrote about land value tax in the 1870s, was this idea of the single tax
Yeah,
movement.
and
So how this relates? Yeah, sorry.
for people who have been listening to us for a little bit, we do have an episode where we have another expert on to talk about municipal finance. I think that was during our Hunter Larkin series that we were
I
doing.
think it was part 2 of Hunter Larkin.
Yeah, part 2 of Hunter Larkin, where we kind of peruse the city of Goddard's finances, and we did have an expert on for that. And she was saying that most cities try and do are either funded through a property tax or a sales tax, which, I mean, this land value tax would basically mean that you didn't have to do either of those, right?
Yeah, right. So Kansas City relies on anywhere between 20 to 22% of their funding comes, and I'm talking Kansas City, Missouri, of course. Anywhere between 20 to 22% comes from sales tax, and then another roughly 50 to 60% comes from property taxes, depending on what you're looking at, right? So through this, you would not have to, like you said, yeah, you wouldn't have to rely on taxing buildings anymore. You wouldn't have to rely on taxing consumption, taxing labor, or anything like that. And that's what's really interesting to me. What's kind of the big appeal about it is that it's a tax on a use of a commodity that nobody created, and the value of which is determined entirely by the public, right? So it's returning publicly created value back into the hands of the public treasury via taxation.
So I think my major question is you normally when you're appraising like the value of something, you usually go for the like property appraisal. Such as here in Kansas City, we had a
Mhm.
big issue with property, being appraised way too high. How do you appraise just purely the value of the land if the land is not usually what's being sold? If it's like a building that's being sold.
Right. Yeah. So we've gotten very good over the years because I mean, humanity has been doing land value assessments for as long as for as long as governments could be collecting taxes, right? And thanks to a lot of recent developments in especially GIS, we've gotten incredibly accurate at assessing land value separate from assessments. Unfortunately, for a variety of historically contingent reasons, a lot of counties just value the entire property, right, as like one whole thing. We look at land and the capital on top of it is the same thing, which is kind of nonsensical. Um, but what you can do, some actual like practical ways to go about this, for example. So parking lots, probably critical support to parking lots, I guess, in that there's basically no improvements on them. It's just empty, vacant land, right? And so whatever you value that, whether it's the government or the market that's valuing that you can create a map of empty lots throughout a city, and then kind of use a geospatial regression analysis to create a sort of gradient, right, across a city to figure out what does adjacent land value look like. So if you have a parking lot right next to another plot of land with like a skyscraper on it, for example, right? You can pretty much say that the land underneath the skyscraper is going to be about at like the same value as the empty parking lot right next to it, because I mean, fundamentally, what really is the difference between the two in terms of land use, right? And so yeah, you can create a gradient map to help with that. Another way too is that whenever we tear down buildings, right, for a brief moment in time there, the land is empty, right, except for I guess the rubble. So you can also do that. There's a lot of different tools. Long story short.
And from uh, previous conversations that I've had with you about this, from my understanding, as a layman, I'm not really, I wouldn't consider myself an expert in this at all, especially compared to you. But the comparison between the parking lot and the skyscraper, although the value of the land is the same, so the tax on that land would be the same. The tax burden is split between everyone living in the skyscraper, whereas the parking
Mm-hmm.
lot owner has to take the brunt of the entire tax bill, right?
Right. And this is the great appeal of it, which is that fundamentally your tax burden is completely agnostic to how you use the land. So if you decide to sit on the land and do literally nothing with it, you're going to be paying the exact same tax as someone who decides to use the land productively. And so what this does is it turns land ownership into a use it or lose it scheme, where in order to afford that tax burden, you got to do something with it. You got to use that land in a productive way that's going to generate revenue. Otherwise, you're basically going to bankrupt yourself by just holding onto this land and not generating any revenue to pay off the tax. And so obviously, like this kills land speculation, right? Because land speculators don't do anything productive with their land. They just hold on to it, wait for the community to do all the hard work of making the place a great place to live, and then extort the community by selling it back to them at a value that they created. And it forces significant infill development in our urban areas, increasing the housing supply, increasing real estate supply, and creating more and more opportunities for people to live, for people to start businesses. So it just makes our cities more vibrant, and creates an economic incentive to create all the wonderful things that we enjoy about cities, all the reasons that people move to cities and create cities in the first place. And that's why I really like it, among a lot of other reasons, of course.
So, what are some? I think Matt mentioned Detroit earlier. What are some examples of cities that have adopted this successfully?
So in the United States, most of the land value tax cities today are out in Pennsylvania. And technically, what they do is what's called split rate taxation, where they tax improvements, or they tax land at a much higher ratio compared to improvements. So some cities out there will do like for every dollar in improvements that they tax. They'll tax $16 in land, for example, which is, land value tax to an extent, right? It accomplishes the same thing. But around the world, um, cities in Taiwan, parts of Hong Kong, Denmark, let's see, parts of Ukraine. Singapore is probably the best example, not necessarily of land value tax, but land value capture. So since the government owns, I think like 90% of the land in Singapore, the government leases out the land at a rate that is about equal to what they would collect in yearly taxes if that land were privately owned by people in the city instead. And they get most of their government revenue from these land sales, right? And it's kind of funny how like libertarians, like right libertarians especially, will hold up Singapore as this wonderful icon of like, oh look, here's a government that doesn't have to rely on hardly any taxes. They have such low taxes on sales and basically nothing on income or corporate income. Oh my God, see, like cutting taxes does great economic growth, guys. But the part that they always leave out, of course, is that they get it all from land value capture, right? Which is the most efficient way to do this. But there are cities in North America that used to have a much more powerful land value tax once upon a time. So Vancouver, British Columbia, back in 1914, actually had a 100% land value tax. And they did this like overnight, right? And it was incredibly successful. I mean, the city, over the course of a few years, came into possession of thousands and thousands of plots of land that were basically acquired via bankruptcy court because they were previously held by land speculators who were not doing anything productive with them. And then the city used this land for very productive purposes. They made parks with it. They used it for public utilities and for just general public infrastructure. And it was going wonderfully. And then city council, several years later, got rid of the land value tax because it was working too well. Because what happened is that the city was depending almost entirely off of land tax revenue to finance government services. And what this did is this kind of created a constituency of people, of what were called ratepayers, who were very irked about the idea that they were the ones that were facing the entire burden of the entire tax burden. And they felt that everybody else ought to be contributing towards the tax coffers, since everyone was benefiting from government expenditures, right? And so they wanted to bring a return.
What type of people were the ones that were bearing that brunt? Like, what it was obviously landowners. So the speculators lost all their land, but if you're, say, like a landlord, like what is the impact on like you?
Oh yeah. So from the perspective of a landlord, right? So in economic terms, a landlord specifically is someone who just holds on to land and then does rent seeking from it, right? Which literally means collecting revenue that is unearned income and an income that you receive specifically because you have the privilege of holding a monopoly over that thing, in this case, land, right? So you're not actually doing anything, you just hold the deed. And so you get to collect increases in value without having to contribute anything, right? So from the perspective of a landlord, post land value tax, they would no longer be able to collect rent. They would no longer be able to do rent seeking off of their properties. Instead, what would happen is landlords would essentially just become building managers, right? Where they would still get to collect on the increases in property value, specifically the building, right? From improvements that they make on it, from maintenance, whatnot, any profits that they may make from hiring people to work the leasing office or to do recruiting for new tenants or whatever, and just the general operations of the building, any profits that they make from that, all fair and square, all theirs, right? But increases to the value of the land, essentially, right, again, rent seeking, that gets taxed by the government, and they no longer get to keep that, essentially. And they don't like that, right? Because rent seeking is easy. You don't have to do any effort. And so people like to make money without doing anything. So
yeah, so if you're a city like Detroit or a city like Kansas City, when it comes to implementing this, there is a lot of, I mean, although Kansas City has a strong, tenants union organization and like a push Kansas City has also passed laws basically limiting Airbnbs almost entirely. Um, there are still, large scale property owners, land speculators, and people who own parking lots or land that is a low value business on a pretty high value piece of land. They're the ones taking the impact from this, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think so. The Detroit mayor, Mike Duggan, he's done a fantastic job, politically speaking, because I mean, and the people that you're talking about are very politically organized, right? So they're going to take all the burden, and they also have most of the political power, and they're just much better at organizing than your average citizen diffuse interest, right? So what the mayor of Detroit has been doing is he's been very open and has done a fantastic job at spreading the educational awareness of the land value tax effects on the average person. So 97% of homeowners in Detroit will see a tax decrease. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because on average, houses or single family houses, anywhere between 30 to 40% of the property is land. And so if you're shifting away from taxing buildings and improvements, and instead you're increasing taxes on land, and in Detroit's case, it's revenue neutral. But even if you're going to increase revenue, this still holds true. The vast majority of homeowners are going to see tax decreases. So if 97% of your constituency is going to make out with more money, and land speculators who are who are sapping away at the productive value of the community are going to be the ones that are going to lose out. There's a very strong political support there for passing this, right? Because this is also being done through a ballot initiative. So by turning out those folks and being like, hey, no, you're gonna do much better under this, right? I think he's done a fantastic job at growing support on the ground for a land value tax. And the same would be very much true in Kansas City, or pretty much really anywhere where you would do this tax shift. So yeah, long story short, I think the best way to do politically is to follow what the mayor of Detroit has been doing, and I'm very excited to see an elected official so passionate and doing such an effective job at spreading awareness and educating the public about the benefits of a land value tax.
Now, Kansas City has a issue where a large portion of the city budget is basically forced to go to the police. This is Kansas City doesn't actually control its own police department. The state of Missouri does. And the state of Missouri can also put a ballot initiative up to the entire state to force Kansas City to increase its budget, basically meaning that the taxpayers of Kansas City are like coerced to doing funding in their own city based off of the wills of people who don't live in the city but live within the state of Missouri.
Yeah.
How this can cause budget issues and will eventually probably rear its ugly head as the not to play into culture war stuff, but the fact that police funding has become such a hot button culture war topic that Missouri last election cycle proved that basically the state could hold Kansas City budget financially hostage. With land value, that's a long way to get around how much, to the question, how much money could Kansas City make by doing a land value tax compared to their already traditional sales, income, and property taxes?
That's a good question. So I tried to go through Jackson County before this. I tried to go through Jackson County property tax as well as Wyandotte property tax GIS data sets. And unfortunately, like most counties across the United States, they lump together building and land value assessments as basically the exact same thing, right? Into just all one whole property assessment. So the only way I would be able to actually provide a concrete number is if I were to go through and create my own GIS regression model using basically parking lots and vacant lots to make a gradient across Kansas City and calculate that myself. But what I can say is, and this is kind of generally true-ish. So in the case of Seattle, we're very blessed that King County does separate assessments between land value and improvement value. So in King County, there is roughly about $32 billion of land value tax revenue that could be generated every year. And well, 32 billion in the first year, right? Like land values, as we know, land value goes up pretty much every single year. So it would be increasing year after year after levying a land value tax pretty significantly, since land value tax makes land much more
So,
productive and therefore increases value.
so what is King County's actual like budget? Like, what is their budget from the taxes they earn currently?
So the city of Seattle right now spends about $7.5 billion, and the King County 2022 budget is roughly, I think, 15 billion or so. So we're talking about at least a double in the operating budget that you could have from public land value capture through a land value tax, right? And this also, of course, is a world in which we're no longer taxing sales, we're no longer taxing improvements, we're no longer taxing business income, we're no longer taxing pretty much anything else. If you wanted to rely entirely on a land tax, you could double the budget of King County.
So, in the hypothetical situation of this is superimposed onto Kansas City,
Mm-hmm.
the e-tax, which is a 1% income tax for funding a bunch of stuff throughout the city, no longer would need to pay that.
Right.
Even if it was implemented at a statewide level, I know you live in Washington State, which doesn't have a state income tax, but you could basically, if you had land value tax, dissolve state income tax to the joys of weird libertarians who think you need licenses for toasters everywhere. But
Yeah, you
and,
could.
and you don't have to be like Texas, who doesn't have a state income tax but has property taxes up the wazoo.
Right, exactly. And well, and I will say too, in Washington's case, we have I think the most regressive tax system in the United States. And it's not because we don't have income tax, but it's because we depend on sales taxes for pretty much most things, which is obviously very regressive on the working class. I mean, it's nice that we don't have income, and there are unfortunately people here who are pushing very hard for an income tax, and I think that's kind of just a product of most progressives, and I'm speaking as a very ardent progressive, who believe that income taxes or a progressive income tax bracket is like the end all be all progressive tax, right? Which is very unfortunate to see people advocating for taxing labor when taxing land is very much an option and always has been an option right there. And in my opinion, is the definitive wealth tax anyway, because the burden will be disproportionately borne by wealthy landowners, right? Which like they're all wealthy, they're all rich as hell, right? And on top of that, it's wealth derived from a good that was not created by anybody, right? Like no one, even if you believe in God, right? Like no man, no person created the land. It's natural. It's created by literally anybody but humanity, but the value is publicly created entirely.
Well, no one created the land until they expand Manhattan, right? Just go into the bay.
True. Although like that, if you're talking about like land reclamation, which is the thing that does come up, technically what that is it's not creating new land, but instead it's just moving water somewhere else because the land underneath has always been there, right? So all you're really doing is just, I mean, it's in the name, right? It's land reclaiming. You're just making the land underneath more productive.
You mean to tell me that I just can't like build an island like in the South China Sea, but it somehow be American sovereign soil that is also have land value tax, but I'm exempt from land value tax because it used to be in the water and it's not actually original land?
Actually, okay, so funny that you bring that up. So there are other ways of doing land value capture other than just taxing dirt. So land in the economic terms, right, doesn't just mean to the dirt, doesn't just refer to the dirt. It's in reference to naturally occurring commodities that are fixed in supply and come with location rent. So that's a lot of very fancy words, but some examples of that is like the ocean, for example, right? Like the ocean point, specific locations in the ocean are fixed, and you can't like create more of a coordinate, right? So you can have rent seeking in the ocean. In fact, most major oil drilling companies do this all the time. You can collect rents from the electromagnetic spectrum because that is also fixed in supply. This is a problem that we have all the time with telecommunication companies who don't really compensate the community or the public writ large for their taking up space on the EM spectrum. And instead, the way that they get like deeds, if you will, or rights to use certain bands of the EM spectrum is by basically just bullying the shit out of the FCC using lobbyists. There's land in orbit, right? So orbits are fixed, and this is now a growing problem with space debris, where satellite companies don't, again, same thing with the telecommunications companies, they don't really have to pay any compensation for how they use certain portions of orbit, certain orbits. And so they're able to just sit there and do rent seeking, right? And the only way that these things are resolved is not through any genuine like market forces or economic incentives. It's just who has the biggest corporate lobbying budget, which is obviously creating some very terrible inefficiencies and just allows them to get away with just awful rent seeking up there to our detriment.
We hate inefficiencies. That's
We
why we're
do.
going to tax the fish and the radio stations.
Yes, I fully support taxing radio stations. Absolutely, yeah, because like it is a problem, really, because I mean, it's fixed in supply, and I mean, they're in particularly busy areas, right, where like you've got a fixed number of frequencies that so many people are competing over. How do you determine really who gets to use those spectrums, those frequencies, right? Like ultimately, it's not about who uses it the most productively. It's who has the budget to lobby the SEC, right? And you can do speculation on the EM spectrum. People do speculation on with internet domain addresses, right? Like you don't actually have to use landvaluetax.com to keep landvaluetax.com, right? You can just sit on it. And then eventually, whenever it gets popular enough due to community demand or whatever, you can extort the next buyer who would come along and want to use it. I mean, we've seen internet domain addresses be sold for millions and millions of dollars, and the only reason that's the case is because
I mean, that was part of the .com boom, right? Where like there were just people buying internet domains, just like before like your bank got on, and this was so prolific that even SNL made a skit right before the .com boom, where it was just like your bank didn't actually go out and become an internet bank until just now, but sadly we were too late to get a domain name, so we are now at this like stupid domain name. I'm totally destroying a good SNL bit, but you can go look it up.
Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly.
That's
That's
probably a lot better than.
yeah. It's a huge problem, and I think ultimately, and this I think really says to the broad appeal of land value tax. Whenever people start to learn more about it, is that it's ultimately concerned with getting rid of, I mean, yeah, speculation, but really just rent seeking and unproductive behavior, right? And reducing and eliminating monopolies, which people tend to dislike, unless you are the monopoly yourself, right? People generally hate undue monopolies, like on land, on internet domain addresses, and that kind of thing. And yeah, that's what land value tax is primarily concerned with, is the monopoly, the private monopoly that comes with unchecked land ownership.
So, what are some resources for the very early on Georgists who have gotten to this point in the podcast to look into? Like, just give us a short list of stuff that they could go to after this podcast.
So, what I would say you should check out is, because I'm gonna take a guess based on how I've listened to some of these earlier episodes. The most listeners are of the urbanist persuasion. And if that's the case, you, dear listener, have probably heard of strong towns. If you have not, you should look up Strong Towns because they're fantastic. But Strong Towns has a huge and super in-depth series on land value tax because they're super, super land tax filled. They have brochures and primers on how to advocate for land value tax in your city or your state or whatever, and also talking about just how it works in general. They have specific case by case examples of like how this a land tax shift would affect city budgets, how it would affect the tax burden of different types of properties. So going to Strong Towns and looking at their various resources would be a great way to start. I would also definitely recommend the shout out to Mr. Beat, not Mr. Beast, but Mr. Beat, who is a Lawrence, Kansas YouTuber and has a video about land value tax. And he also talks about the history of Georgism and Henry George as well. So you can literally just look up. I think the title of the video is "I found the least bad tax" or something like that. Or you can just look up Mr. Beat and land value tax, and it'll come up. And that's a very short, I think, 10 to 15-minute video. But if you're more into also just kind of reading the story of land value tax and and Henry George in general, I think the thing that what got me into land value tax and what has also really kicked off a lot of pandemic era, I guess I'll call land value tax enthusiasm was Lars Doucet's. I'm butchering his last name, but it's like Doucet. Progress in Poverty book review. Progress in Poverty is the book that Henry George wrote in like the 1870s or something, that outlined his issues with land ownership, private land ownership, and then he talks about what the solution is, which is a land value tax. It's on the Astro Codex, which is like this blog where they post long written stories. But if you Google, I'm going to try right now, Lars, like Lars, and then Doucet, and then land is a big deal, is what his thing is called. Yeah, land is a big deal. And just read through that. It's very long, very detailed, but it goes through everything. And at the end of it, you hopefully won't have any questions about land value tax, and you'll hopefully be land pilled and maybe even George pilled if you want to go that far. But yeah, that's what I would highly encourage people to look into. And I will warn you, once you get into it, I don't know, it's a rabbit hole. And if you get into it deep enough, and once it all starts to make sense, you start to see the cat, as Georges will say, which refers to walking around and seeing vacant lots in highly productive areas, and you'll start to understand, why do these vacant lots exist? Why is there all this economic demand, all this productivity, and yet we've got land held out, not in use, right? And a variety of other issues as well. It all kind of starts to make sense. So yeah.
Yeah, I hear about land value tax on an almost daily basis from Ben. So I'm just going to let you know that this might ruin your life if you do look into it.
Yeah.
We will put the links to a lot of that stuff that Ben has suggested in the description of the podcast. You'll be able to check that out. Finally, the one thing I do want to go over, though, is do you prefer like land value tax enthusiast? Do you prefer LVT, or do you prefer being called a Georgist?
Oh, okay. So I'll try to keep this brief. I'm more of a first of all, I'm a socialist, right? And I am also a land value tax enthusiast. I incorporate land value tax into my view of socialism, specifically kind of like the libertarian market socialist flavor. Because ultimately, what land value tax is to me is it's public capture of publicly created land value. Right? It's the redistribution of what is created by the public back into the hands of the public, which is very socialist in my opinion. Unfortunately, most Georgists they don't consider themselves socialist per se. They're very much like, they kind of do see themselves as this, oh, we're not socialist, we're not capitalist, we're our own entire thing. And I can understand why they would get to that. But I don't consider myself Georgist, not necessarily because of that, but because the average Georgist, or at least the online ones, are incredibly cringe. The long story short on this is that for the last 100 years or so, Georgism mostly has been kind of written off by neoclassical economists for unfair reasons. And so it's hard for the average Georgist to find company among economists until recently. Actually, economics has been finally embracing Georgism in some of its policy prescriptions, but especially the land value tax. And so, as a result of that, because they've been kind of shrugged off by the economist community, they find themselves in friendly camps with other types of folks who have been shrugged off by the economist community, particularly Austrian. I'm using air quotes here, economists. And so a lot of Georgists will find themselves falling into, I don't want to say conspiratorial thinking, but non-critical thinking about economic issues. And it's kind of sad because they're very much right about the land issue. And so they see the cat on that one. They see the land issue and how it affects everything. And so they think they stumbled upon something that nobody else has, which in some regards is very much true. And so then they take that sort of thinking to like literally everything else, right? As Austrians have with monetary policy. And so they will let themselves get into certain mindsets about economics and public policy that is just totally off base, whack as hell, and just kind of makes it difficult to give the Georgist movement any and all credibility. So I'm more concerned with the tax policy itself, because that is for sure, it has a mountain of evidence backing it up. It's effective. We know it works. We have real world examples of it working. It's not some theoretical thing. It doesn't require, it doesn't require theory or anything like that. It works. We know it works. So yeah, I'm not really ideologically Georgist, but I do sympathize with anti-monopolism, of course. But yeah, I'm a socialist who really, really likes taxing landowners and especially landlords.
Well, that is, probably the best way to go about it from my understanding, but also all of my land value tax understanding comes from you, Ben. If there's any economic PhD programs that are looking for a good candidate, check out
Thank
Ben.
you.
Be a good fit for that.
Yeah, if you happen to be a PhD who's in charge of a major college who's listening to this podcast, what are you doing?
Honestly, well, I hope to one day be a PhD econ candidate, also listening to this podcast. So I would love to join that company. Yeah, of course.
So any final comments or thoughts you have, Ben, or any shout outs you want to do?
Doesn't have to be about land value.
Can it be about land value tax? Because this is the thing that I talk to about. I talk to people about this every goddamn day. This has, Matt, ever since you introduced me to this shit back in 2020, it has consumed my life. It is impossible to go on.
Wait, Matt, you introduced
him? Okay. I found the Mr. Beat YouTube video, and we watched it together, and then I didn't think anything of it until he came back like a month later with just an entire rant and Excel spreadsheets. Yeah,
I have been ruined by this. In a very good way, right? Because I'm applying to grad school programs to study this, and I am very interested in land economics, as unsexy as it may be. It affects a lot of things. And I guess what I would say to anyone who's listening who might become interested, I hope, in land taxation and making our cities more financially solvent, more financially sustainable, instead of relying on these other regressive forms of taxation, get involved in your local politics. Find out who's running for local city council. Read about land value tax. Look at strong towns. Right. Learn some of the details of this. You don't have to become an expert. You don't have to become a land tax foamer like myself to make a difference. Just having a general idea of what land tax can do and how it can benefit your cities. And then with that, get involved in local politics. Talk to your city councilors. Talk to your talk to your county councilors. If you do live in King County, definitely talk to King County councilors about this. We need all the help we can get out here. But yeah, get involved and talk to political candidates. Talk to your legislators, your political representatives about this. Because ultimately, what the main reason why it doesn't exist in the first place is because there's just not a lot of it's just not well known. It's kind of a niche thing. It used to be very popular a long time ago, and now it's not for historically contingent reasons. But we can change that, right? And it doesn't take much to change it in the first place, right? The United States has been over its entire history has been shaped very aggressively by small groups of people who get very politically active, especially at the local level. And so if you're interested in this, and if you want to, again, see your cities thrive and be financially prosperous, be part of that small group of people who gets really into tax policy and zoning and parking minimums and urbanism writ large. Show up to your city council meetings and tell them to stop taxing homes and start taxing land. So go out there, go with God, and see the cat and tax the land.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Ben, for coming on. This has been.
Is there anything? Do you want people to be able to find you? Do you want to like plug?
I don't think I have anything public to plug. I mean, you will probably see my name come up in an urbanist article sometime in the near future about land value tax in Seattle. So if you do read the Urbanist, if you're in the Puget Sound area, watch out for that. Yeah, I'm just going to plug Strong Towns. Look at the Strong Towns land value tax series. That's the main thing I want to plug for sure.
All right. Well, this has been another episode of Clio Talk. I've been Matt.
And I have been RC.
And we have had...
Ben Ferlo.
Yeah. You can follow us on Twitter at Clio History. You can email us at cliohistorypodcast@gmail.com. We are available wherever you get podcasts. Likes, shares, and reviews really do help us in the algorithm. We have had some pretty good success. If you want to see more COVID or KC mob stories, because that seems like what you guys actually want out of us these days.
Yeah.
We can.
And if you want to send any angry emails about this episode, we will forward them to Ben. And
I will.
There we go. All right. Yeah. So we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Bye.